Imagine everything familiar to you. Your homeland, your family, the entire world you've ever known, had to be abandoned because of a voice speaking to you. Imagine that same voice declaring you'd father entire nations when you didn't have a single child. Imagine being commanded to offer up as a sacrifice the very son that voice had guaranteed you. This isn't some made-up tale. This is the account of a single individual whose belief altered the trajectory of humanity permanently. His name, Abraham. And billions of people spanning 3 dominant global religions call him the father of faith. We're talking about Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. However, before receiving the name Abraham, he went by Abram. Just a regular man dwelling in territories devoted to idol worship, encircled by fraudulent deities and hollow guarantees. Then came the moment when the singular true God communicated, and everything transformed forever. What you're about to discover is an account filled with promises that seemed unreachable, perilous expeditions, and trials capable of destroying most individuals. It chronicles someone who deceived others to preserve his own existence, who grasped control when trusting seemed irrational, and who confronted the supreme trial no parent ought to experience. Still, throughout every challenge, he evolved into the most extraordinary demonstration of faith humanity has witnessed. Prepare yourself to encounter the astounding account of Abraham, the father of nations. Many years ago, in a location known as Ur of the Chaldeans, a man called Abram made his home. This stood as among the most developed metropolitan areas throughout the ancient era, positioned in Mesopotamia, close to modern-day Iraq. Prosperity and influence defined the city, brimming with traders, artisans, and learned individuals. Renown came from its colossal step towers, designated as ziggurats, immense constructions ascending dramatically toward the heavens, where inhabitants climbed upward for worshipping their deities. Yet these weren't authentic gods. These amounted to mere sculptures fashioned from timber, rock, and metal, incapable of sight, hearing, or performing any action whatsoever. The population of Ur venerated the lunar deity alongside innumerable additional idols. They prostrated themselves before inanimate objects, presented offerings to sculptures unable to acknowledge them, and constructed their complete society surrounding the service of gods possessing zero genuine existence. Religious processions filled the streets. Incense smoke burned for idols, saturated the atmosphere, and false worship permeated the entire culture. Abram's father bore the name Terah, and Scripture reveals something significant regarding his family heritage. Joshua chapter 24 verse 2 states, Joshua addressed all the people, declaring, "This is what the Lord, Israel's God, proclaims. Long ago your forefathers, including Terah, Abraham and Nahor's father, resided beyond the Euphrates River, and they worshipped different gods. Consequently, Abram's upbringing wasn't in a household devoted to God. His very own father engaged in the idol worship dominating Ur. Daily he observed people bowing toward statues, priests conducting intricate ceremonies for fraudulent gods, and temples packed with images people regarded as divine entities. This represented everything he understood, the cultural atmosphere he breathed, the religion practiced by his family, the standard everyday existence of Ur. However, something distinguished Abram from others. While everyone surrounding him bowed toward lifeless sculptures, never speaking or moving, Abram perceived something beyond these hollow rituals, something genuine, something authentic. The living God who brought everything into existence was observing Abram and was preparing to interrupt his life in ways destined to transform human history permanently. One particular day, amid Abram's routine existence, something remarkable took place. The Lord himself communicated directly with Abram. Genesis chapter 12, verse 1 preserves precisely what God declared. The Lord had instructed Abram, Depart from your homeland, your relatives, and your father's family to the territory I will reveal to you. Consider how astonishing this moment truly was. Abram had invested his complete life encircled by mute idols, never speaking, never moving, never acknowledging anyone. Regardless of how desperately individuals prayed, people would position themselves before these sculptures for extended periods, crying out, seeking responses. Yet the idols simply remained there, cold and without life. Now Abram was hearing something entirely different, the voice belonging to the living God, not some statue, not an idol, but God himself speaking in a direct, personal, unmistakable manner. The God responsible for creating the universe was engaging in dialogue with one individual. And what did God request? Abandon everything. Depart from your homeland. Exit the territory where your birth occurred, the location you designate as home, your people. Abandon your relatives, your community, everyone you've recognized, your father's family. Exit the family enterprise, your inheritance, your stability, and travel where? God provided Abram with no map. He simply stated, "To the territory I will reveal to you." You're traveling somewhere, Abram, but I'm withholding the exact location. You must begin walking before the destination becomes visible. You must trust me sufficiently to execute the initial step. This wasn't some minor request. During Abram's era, your homeland, your people, and your father's household represented everything. They established your identity, furnished your security, and assigned you your position within the world. Abandoning all three signified becoming nobody, forfeiting your complete identity, and commencing entirely over. And here's another essential detail. Abram wasn't some young individual seeking adventure. We discover subsequently that Abram had reached 75 years when he departed. 75. Most individuals at that age would be establishing stability, not initiating a massive expedition into absolute uncertainty. Yet when the Creator summons you, everything transforms. This represented the identical voice that spoke stars into being, and presently it was extending an invitation to one individual into a relationship spanning all generations. God didn't simply instruct Abram to depart without providing any rationale or expectation. He established 7 astounding promises appearing completely unreachable for a childless, 5-year-old individual. In Genesis chapter 12, verses 2 and 3, God presented his promises. I will transform you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will establish your name as great, and you will become a blessing. I will bless whoever blesses you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, and every people on earth will receive blessing through you. Let's enumerate these promises meticulously. First, I will transform you into a great nation. A nation signifies thousands, potentially millions of individuals, armies, cities, culture, and influence. Yet Abram possessed no children, not even a single one. His wife Sarai remained barren. How could this become possible? Second, I will bless you. God would personally distribute favor throughout Abram's life, protect him, provide for him, and render everything he accomplished successful. Third, I will establish your name as great. Abram's name would receive remembrance and honor across all of history. Individuals thousands of years subsequently would still recognize his identity. Fourth, you will become a blessing. Abram wouldn't merely receive blessings, he would transform into a source of blessing toward others. His life would improve other people's lives. Fifth, I will bless whoever blesses you. Anyone treating Abram favorably would receive God's favor reciprocally. Supporting Abram signified obtaining God's attention positively. Sixth, whoever curses you, I will curse. Anyone attempting to harm Abram would confront God's judgment. God was positioning his own reputation at stake to protect this single individual. And seventh, the most staggering promise. Every people on earth will receive blessing through you. Not merely Abram's family or future nation, but every tribe, every race, every nation across the complete planet would somehow obtain a blessing through his family lineage. This promise extended far beyond anything Abram could comprehend. These represented covenant promises from God himself, permanent, unbreakable commitments. However, they demanded faith. Abram couldn't observe any evidence yet. He possessed no children, no territory, no nation, no distinguished name. He simply had God's word. He faced a choice: remain in comfortable Ur, or trust this voice and advance into the unknown, believing God would accomplish the impossible. Abram reached his decision. He selected faith. Genesis chapter 12, verse 4 informs us. Consequently, Abram departed, as the Lord had instructed him, and Lot accompanied him. Abram had reached 75 years when he departed from Haran. Wait, Haran? Wasn't he supposed to exit from Ur? Here's what transpired. Abram's father, Terah, had actually initiated a journey from Ur toward Canaan, but halted midway at Haran and established residence there instead of completing the trip. Genesis chapter 11, verses 31 and 32 explain. Terah took his son Abram, his grandson Lot, who was Haran's son, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, Abram's wife. And collectively, they departed from Ur of the Chaldeans to travel to Canaan. However, when they arrived at Haran, they settled there. Terah lived 205 years, and he passed away in Haran. Consequently, following his father's death in Haran, Abram, presently 75 years old, completed the journey left unfinished. This time, he wasn't following his father. He was following God directly. Genesis chapter 12, verse 5, provides us the complete picture. He took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, all the possessions they had gathered, and the individuals they had acquired in Haran. And they departed for the territory of Canaan. And they reached there. This represented a massive caravan. They possessed belongings, tents, supplies, tools, household items. They possessed people, servants and workers who comprised their household. They possessed flocks and herds, sheep, goats, cattle, donkeys furnishing milk, meat, wool, and transportation. Relocating all of this resembled moving an entire village. Abram was abandoning civilization behind to transform into a wanderer possessing no permanent residence. He was exchanging houses for tents, cities for open fields, security for uncertainty. Every step transported him farther from everything familiar and closer toward something he couldn't yet observe. A promise from God appearing impossible, but which Abram selected to believe. Following years of delay in Haran, Abram was presently walking completely in obedience to God's summons. When Abram reached Canaan, he didn't halt at the border. He continued traveling through the territory, exploring this location God had promised. Genesis chapter 12, verse 6 informs us. Abram traveled through the territory as far as the site of the great tree of Moreh at Shechem. At that time, the Canaanites occupied the land. Shechem was positioned in Canaan's heart, within a valley between two mountains. The great tree of Moreh stood as a recognized landmark where people assembled. However, notice the essential detail. At that time, the Canaanites occupied the land. This wasn't vacant territory. People already resided here, possessing cities, farms, armies, and their own pagan deities. They weren't planning to surrender their territory to a nomad claiming God promised it to him. God's promise would demand even greater faith. Then something powerful transpired. Genesis chapter 12, verse 7 states, "The Lord appeared to Abram and declared, 'To your offspring I will provide this land.' Consequently, he constructed an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him." God appeared to Abram. The text doesn't clarify exactly how, but Abram recognized without any uncertainty that God existed there with him, and God rendered his promise even more precise. To your offspring I will provide this land. Your descendants will possess everything you observe right now. Not perhaps, not possibly. Will provide. It was certain, established, accomplished in God's perception, even though it hadn't manifested yet in time. Even though Abram possessed no children, even though the Canaanites resided here with their established civilization, God proclaimed it an absolute certainty. In God's perception, the territory already belonged to Abram's future family. This represented an overwhelming confirmation that yes, this is the location. This is where your future exists. Right there at Shechem, where God appeared and communicated these promises, Abram constructed an altar. Genesis chapter 12, verse 7, informs us. Consequently, he constructed an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. An altar was a worship location fashioned by stacking stones collectively, where individuals presented sacrifices to God. By constructing this altar, Abram was honoring God for appearing to him, marking this spot as a location where he encountered the living God and establishing a public declaration. The true God has communicated to me here, and I worship him exclusively. However, Abram didn't conclude with just one altar. Genesis chapter 12 verse 8 states, "From there he proceeded toward the hills east of Bethel and established his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. There he constructed an altar to the Lord and invoked the name of the Lord." Another altar, another worship location. Notice what else the text states. "And invoked the name of the Lord." Abram prayed audibly. He communicated to God. He worshipped out loud, perhaps with his household assembled around. In Canaan, altars existed everywhere, but they represented altars to fraudulent gods like Baal, Asherah, and Molech. The Canaanites worshipped creation instead of the Creator, bowing toward the sun, moon, and stars. Their worship incorporated horrible practices, including child sacrifice. However, Abram's altars were distinctive. They were dedicated to the one true God who had communicated to him personally. Each altar resembled a spiritual flag positioned in the ground, proclaiming, "The living God is genuine, and I worship him here." In a territory dominated by darkness and fraudulent religion, Abram was introducing light and authentic worship. Then Genesis chapter 12, verse 9 states, "Then Abram departed and continued toward the Negev." The Negev was the southern desert region of Canaan. Abram transformed into a nomad, relocating his tents and flocks from location to location. However, wherever he traveled, he worshipped God. These altars weren't merely religious ceremonies, they represented relationship markers. Each altar proclaimed, "God encountered me here, spoke to me here, exists with me here." Abram was constructing his life surrounding his relationship with God. Everything appeared to progress well. Abram had obeyed God, received direct confirmation, and was exploring the promised territory. However, then, something unexpected and challenging occurred. Genesis chapter 12 verse 10 informs us. Now there existed a famine in the territory, and Abram traveled down to Egypt to reside there for a period because the famine was severe. A famine. No rain descended, the crops failed, the grass withered, there wasn't sufficient food for Abram's household or his flocks. This represented a serious, life-threatening crisis. Abram had obeyed God and was presently in the territory God promised him. Still, he confronted starvation. Occasionally, when we obey God, we anticipate everything becoming effortless. However, that's not consistently how it operates. Obedience doesn't guarantee the elimination of challenges. The famine was severe, not a minor shortage, but a dangerous situation demanding immediate action. What should Abram do? He reached a practical decision. Travel to Egypt temporarily until the famine subsided. Egypt made logical sense. While Canaan depended completely on seasonal rains for water, Egypt possessed the Nile River. Annually, the Nile flooded and deposited behind rich soil. perfect for agriculture. Egypt almost consistently possessed food when surrounding nations experienced drought. For centuries, Egypt had represented the location people traveled when food became scarce. The text states Abram traveled to reside there for a period. This was temporary. He wasn't abandoning Canaan permanently. He was executing a short-term decision to survive a crisis. The Bible doesn't directly criticize Abram for traveling to Egypt. Occasionally, faith signifies executing practical steps to survive challenging circumstances while continuing to trust God for the larger picture. Consequently, Abram assembled his household. His wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, all his servants, his flocks, his possessions, and headed southwest toward Egypt. They were exiting the territory of promise and entering a powerful pagan empire governed by Pharaoh, who was regarded as a deity by his people. Egypt was prosperous and sophisticated, but also dangerous for foreigners. As Abram's caravan traveled toward Egypt, fear began gripping his heart. And this fear guided him to execute a terrible decision. As Abram approached Egypt's border with his wife Sarai, fear began gripping his heart and overwhelming his faith. He looked at his wife Sarai and couldn't cease worrying about one thing. She was beautiful, even though they were both older. Abram was 75 and Sarai was 65. She remained a strikingly beautiful woman who would capture men's attention wherever they traveled. And Abram understood exactly how powerful men functioned in the ancient world. He recognized that if a king or official desired a married woman, he might simply execute her husband and seize the woman for himself. Fear made Abram forget everything. Fear made him forget regarding the 7 promises God had established. Fear made him forget that God had appeared to him personally. Fear made him forget that God needed to maintain him alive to fulfill those promises regarding transforming him into a great nation. Fear displaced all his faith and replaced it with self-preservation and panic. Genesis chapter 12, verses 11 through 13, demonstrate what Abram declared to his wife. As he was preparing to enter Egypt, he declared to his wife Sarai, "I recognize what a beautiful woman you are. When the Egyptians observe you, they will declare, 'This is his wife.' Then they will execute me, but will permit you to live. Declare you are my sister, so that I will receive favorable treatment for your sake, and my life will be preserved because of you." Abram requested his wife to deceive. He requested her to pretend she wasn't married to him. His reasoning appeared logical. If they recognize "You're my wife," they'll execute me to seize you. However, if they think you're my sister, they'll permit me to live. This was regarding self-preservation. Abram was willing to position his wife in a vulnerable and dangerous position merely to rescue his own life. How could God's promises materialize if Sarai transformed into another man's wife? The complete plan faced risk because of Abram's fear. Sarai agreed to the plan, and when they entered Egypt, disaster struck. Genesis chapter 12, verses 14 and 15 state, "When Abram arrived in Egypt, the Egyptians observed that Sarai was a very beautiful woman. And when Pharaoh's officials observed her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and she was transported into his palace." It wasn't merely random men noticing Sarai. Pharaoh's own officials, the highest-ranking men in Egypt, observed her and were so impressed, they proceeded straight to the king and informed him regarding this beautiful woman. Because everyone thought she was merely Abram's sister and therefore available, she was transported into Pharaoh's palace. The most powerful individual in Egypt presently possessed Sarai, planning to establish her as his wife. Everything God promised now faced jeopardy. And what regarding Abram? Genesis chapter 12, verse 16 states, "He treated Abram favorably for her sake. And Abram acquired sheep and cattle, male and female donkeys, male and female servants, and camels." Abram was becoming wealthy from his deception. Pharaoh distributed gifts on him, livestock, servants, camels, all valuable possessions. Abram was safe, alive, and prosperous. However, his wife existed in another man's palace, preparing to transform into another man's wife. However, God. These are the most significant words. However, God intervened. Genesis chapter 12, verse 17 states, "However, the Lord inflicted serious diseases on Pharaoh and his household because of Abram's wife, Sarai." God transmitted plagues with serious diseases on Pharaoh and everyone in his house. God was protecting his plan and his promises, even though Abram had failed. God was being faithful even when his servant wasn't. Pharaoh realized something was terribly wrong and discovered the truth. Genesis chapter 12, verses 18 and 19 demonstrate his angry response. Consequently, Pharaoh summoned Abram. "What have you executed to me?" he declared. "Why didn't you inform me she was your wife? Why did you declare she is my sister so that I took her to become my wife? Now then, here is your wife. Take her and depart." Consider how shameful this was. A pagan king who worshipped fraudulent gods was rebuking God's chosen individual for deception and lying. Pharaoh possessed every right to be furious. He could have executed Abram, imprisoned him, or seized everything he possessed. However, instead, he simply wanted them departed from his territory. Genesis chapter 12, verse 20 concludes, "Then Pharaoh issued orders regarding Abram to his men, and they transmitted him on his way with his wife and everything he possessed. Pharaoh assigned men to escort them out, both for protection and to ensure they actually departed. Abram exited Egypt with Sarai safely returned, all his possessions, and all the wealth he had obtained from Pharaoh. He was physically safe and financially improved compared to when he arrived. However, he also departed with something else, a painful lesson carved deep into his memory. His deception had almost destroyed everything God promised. His fear had positioned the complete plan of God at serious risk. His attempt to rescue himself through deception had backfired completely, and only God's direct intervention had rescued him from the catastrophic disaster he created. Faith signifies trusting God even when you're afraid, even when circumstances appear dangerous, even when you can't observe how things will resolve. It signifies believing God will protect you without manipulating situations through deceptions and schemes. Abram's detour to Egypt revealed a weakness in his character that would surface again and would affect his family for generations to follow. Following exiting Egypt, Abram returned to Canaan with Sarai, Lot, and all their wealth. Genesis chapter 13, verses 1 and 2, inform us. Consequently, Abram traveled up from Egypt to the Negev with his wife and everything he possessed, and Lot traveled with him. Abram had transformed into very wealthy in livestock and in silver and gold. They were no longer merely nomads, they were prosperous, possessing large flocks, herds, and many servants. However, this wealth generated a problem. Genesis chapter 13, verses 5 through 7 explain. Now Lot, who was relocating about with Abram, also possessed flocks and herds and tents, but the territory could not support them while they remained together, for their possessions were so extensive that they were not able to remain together, and quarreling arose between Abram's herders and Lot's. The Canaanites and Perizzites were also residing in the territory at that time. The servants who cared for the animals initiated fighting over grazing territory and water. This ongoing conflict was transpiring in front of the pagan nations surrounding them. Abram had to reach a decision. He was older, the uncle, the leader. He could have instructed Lot what to execute, but Abram selected generosity. Genesis chapter 13, verses 8 and 9 demonstrate his offer. Consequently, Abram declared to Lot, "Let's not have any quarreling between you and me, or between your herders and mine, for we are close relatives. Is not the complete territory before you? Let's separate. If you travel to the left, I'll travel to the right. If you travel to the right, I'll travel to the left." Abram valued peace over his rights. He provided Lot first selection. Lot looked around and observed the Jordan Valley. Genesis chapter 13 verse 10 states, Lot looked around and observed that the complete plain of the Jordan toward Zoar was well watered, like the garden of the Lord, like the territory of Egypt. It was lush, green, and fertile. Genesis chapter 13 verse 11 informs us. Consequently, Lot selected for himself the complete plain of the Jordan and departed toward the east. The two men separated. Lot seized the best territory. Abram obtained whatever remained. However, Genesis chapter 13, verses 12 and 13 add, Abram resided in the territory of Canaan, while Lot resided among the cities of the plain and established his tents near Sodom. Now the people of Sodom were wicked and were sinning greatly against the Lord. Lot selected based on appearance, not considering spiritual danger. Lot's selection positioned him in danger. Genesis chapter 14, verses 1 and 2 introduce a war. At the time when Amraphel was king of Shinar, Arioch king of Elazar, Kedorlaomer king of Elam, and Tidal king of Goyim, these kings advanced to war against Bera, king of Sodom, Birsha king of Gomorrah, Shinab king of Admah, Shemeba king of Zeboyim, and the king of Bela. 4 powerful eastern kings attacked 5 local kings. The invaders prevailed and seized everything. Genesis chapter 14, verses 11 and 12 state, The 4 kings seized all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their food. Then they departed. They also carried off Abram's nephew Lot and his possessions, since he was residing in Sodom. Lot was captured as a prisoner of war. When Abram heard this, he acted immediately. Genesis chapter 14, verses 14 and 15 inform us. When Abram heard that his relative had been captured, he summoned the 318 trained men born in his household and pursued them as far as Dan. During the night, Abram divided his men to attack them, and he routed them, pursuing them as far as Hobah, north of Damascus. Abram transformed into a warrior. He assembled 318 trained fighters from his household, chased the armies northward, launched a surprise night attack, and prevailed decisively. Genesis chapter 14 verse 16 states, He recovered all the goods and brought back his relative Lot and his possessions, together with the women and the other people. Abram rescued Lot and everyone else. Family mattered beyond past disagreements. Following the victory, 2 kings encountered Abram. Genesis chapter 14 verse 17 states, Following Abram returned from defeating Kedorlaomer, and the kings allied with him. The king of Sodom emerged to encounter him in the valley of Shaveh. However, first, someone else appeared. Genesis chapter 14, verses 18 through 20 inform us. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High, and he blessed Abram, declaring, Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and praise be to God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand. Then Abram provided him 1/10 of everything. Melchizedek was king of Salem and priest of the true God. He blessed Abram and praised God for the victory. Abram provided him 10% of everything, recognizing his spiritual authority. Then the king of Sodom spoke. Genesis chapter 14, verse 21 states, The king of Sodom declared to Abram, Provide me the people and keep the goods for yourself. He offered to permit Abram to keep all the wealth, but Abram refused. Genesis chapter 14, verses 22 through 24, record his response. However, Abram declared to the king of Sodom, With raised hand I have sworn an oath to the Lord, God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, that I will accept nothing belonging to you, not even a thread or the strap of a sandal, so that you will never be able to declare, I made Abram wealthy. I will accept nothing except what my men have consumed, and the share that belongs to the men who traveled with me." Abram wouldn't seize anything from Sodom's wicked king. He didn't want this pagan ruler claiming he made Abram prosperous. His wealth would originate from God exclusively. Following these events, God communicated to Abram. Genesis chapter 15 verse 1 states, "Following this, the word of the Lord arrived to Abram in a vision. 'Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward.'" However, Abram possessed a deep concern. Genesis chapter 15, verses 2 and 3 demonstrate his question. However, Abram declared, "Sovereign Lord, what can you provide me since I remain childless? And the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus?" And Abram declared, "You have provided me no children. Consequently, a servant in my household will become my heir." Abram was advancing in age, with no son. His servant would inherit everything. How could God's promises materialize? God's answer was clear. Genesis chapter 15, verse 4 states, "Then the word of the Lord arrived to him. 'This man will not become your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will become your heir.' Then God demonstrated him something beautiful. Genesis chapter 15, verse 5 informs us. He took him outside and declared, 'Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them.' Then he declared to him, 'So shall your offspring be.' God demonstrated Abram the stars, thousands filling the night sky. 'That's how many descendants you'll possess,' God declared. Genesis chapter 15, verse 6 records Abram's response. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. Abram believed God despite the impossibility, and God counted this faith as righteousness. Then God established a formal covenant. Abram prepared animals as instructed. Genesis chapter 15, verse 12 states, "As the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness arrived over him. God positioned Abram to sleep and communicated regarding the future. His descendants would be enslaved for 400 years, but then freed. Genesis chapter 15, verse 17, describes what transpired. When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking firepot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. God himself passed between the pieces. But Abram didn't. This was one-sided. God exclusively would maintain these promises. Genesis chapter 15, verse 18 records, "On that day the Lord established a covenant with Abram and declared, 'To your descendants I provide this territory, from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates.' God defined exact boundaries. Time passed with no child. Sarai remained barren, so she developed a plan. Genesis chapter 16, verses 1 and 2 explain. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. However, she possessed an Egyptian slave named Hagar. Consequently, she declared to Abram, 'The Lord has kept me from having children. Travel, sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can construct a family through her.' Abram agreed to what Sarai declared. In ancient culture, a barren wife could provide her servant to her husband, and the child would legally belong to the wife. Sarai was attempting to assist God fulfill his promise. It appeared logical and followed cultural norms. However, it wasn't God's plan. Abram agreed without seeking God's guidance. Genesis chapter 16, verse 3 informs us. Consequently, following Abram had been residing in Canaan 10 years. Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian slave Hagar and provided her to her husband to become his wife. 10 years had passed since reaching Canaan. Their patience had depleted. Genesis chapter 16 verse 4 demonstrates the result. He slept with Hagar, and she conceived. When she recognized she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Hagar became pregnant quickly. Once she recognized she was carrying Abram's child. She transformed proud and looked down on Sarai. She could execute what Sarai couldn't. Provide Abram a child. This generated terrible conflict. Genesis chapter 16, verse 5 demonstrates Sarai's reaction. Then Sarai declared to Abram, "You are responsible for the wrong I am experiencing. I positioned my slave in your arms, and now that she recognizes she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me." Sarai was angry and blamed Abram, even though this was her idea. Abram wanted to avoid the conflict. Genesis chapter 16, verse 6 states, "Your slave is in your hands," Abram declared. "Execute with her whatever you think best." Then Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. Sarai treated Hagar harshly, and the pregnant woman ran away into the dangerous desert. In the desert, God discovered Hagar. Genesis chapter 16, verse 7 informs us. The angel of the Lord discovered Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was the spring that is beside the road to Shur. God cared regarding this Egyptian servant girl. He observed her suffering and transmitted his angel to assist her. Genesis chapter 16, verses 9 through 11 record the conversation. Then the angel of the Lord instructed her, "Return to your mistress and submit to her." The angel added, "I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count." The angel of the Lord also declared to her, "You are now pregnant, and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery." God instructed Hagar to return and submit, though it would be challenging. However, he also promised her numerous descendants. She would possess a son named Ishmael, meaning God hears. God had heard her suffering. The angel also informed her regarding Ishmael's character. Genesis chapter 16 verse 12 states, "He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And he will reside in hostility toward all his brothers." Ishmael would be fierce, independent, and reside in conflict with others. Hagar was amazed, God observed her. Genesis chapter 16 verse 13 records, "She provided this name to the Lord who communicated to her, 'You are the God who sees me.' For she declared, 'I have now observed the one who sees me.'" She designated God, the God who sees me. She, a lowly servant, had been noticed by God himself. Hagar returned. Genesis chapter 16 verses 15 and 16 inform us. Consequently, Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram provided the name Ishmael to the son she had born. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael. Abram presently possessed a son at age 86. However, Ishmael wasn't the fulfillment of God's promise. He was born from human planning, from impatience, from attempting to assist God instead of waiting. He was Abram's son, but not the son of the promise. 13 years passed in silence. Then, when Abram was 99, God appeared again. Genesis chapter 17 verse 1 states, "When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to him and declared, 'I am God Almighty. Walk before me faithfully and be blameless.'" God introduced himself as God Almighty and renewed his covenant. Genesis chapter 17, verses 3 and 4 state, "Abram fell face down, and God declared to him, 'As for me, this is my covenant with you. You will become the father of many nations.'" Not merely one nation, many nations. Then God changed his name. Genesis chapter 17, verse 5 records, "No longer will you be designated Abram, your name will be Abraham, for I have made you a father of many nations." Abram transformed into Abraham, father of many. The name change signaled a new identity and destiny. God provided more promises. Genesis chapter 17, verses 6 and 7 state, "I will make you very fruitful. I will make nations of you, and kings will originate from you. I will establish my covenant as an everlasting covenant between me and you and your descendants, following you for the generations to come, to be your God and the God of your descendants following you. This covenant would last permanently through all generations. Then God provided a sign. Genesis chapter 17, verses 10 and 11 explain, "This is my covenant with you and your descendants following you, the covenant you are to maintain. Every male among you shall be circumcised. You are to undergo circumcision, and it will be the sign of the covenant between me and you." Circumcision would be the physical mark, demonstrating they belong to God's covenant people. Every male would be circumcised as a sign. God also changed Sarai's name. Genesis chapter 17, verse 15 states, God also declared to Abraham, "As for Sarai, your wife, you are no longer to designate her Sarai. Her name will be Sarah." Sarai, transformed into Sarah, princess. Then arrived the specific promise. Genesis chapter 17, verse 16 declares, "I will bless her, and will surely provide you a son by her. I will bless her, so that she will become the mother of nations. Kings of peoples will originate from her." This was the first time God explicitly stated the promised child would originate through Sarah. Abraham laughed. Genesis chapter 17, verse 17 informs us, Abraham fell face down. He laughed and declared to himself, "Will a son be born to a man 100 years old? Will Sarah bear a child at the age of 90? Abraham laughed in disbelief. He was almost 100. Sarah was 90. This appeared medically impossible. Abraham suggested an alternative. Genesis chapter 17, verse 18 states, "And Abraham declared to God, 'If only Ishmael might reside under your blessing.'" Abraham was declaring, "What? Regarding Ishmael? Can't he be the one?" However, God was firm. Genesis chapter 17, verses 19 through 21 record, "Then God declared, 'Yes, but your wife Sarah will bear you a son, and you will designate him Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his descendants following him. And as for Ishmael, I have heard you. I will surely bless him. I will make him fruitful, and will greatly increase his numbers. He will become the father of 12 rulers, and I will make him into a great nation. However, my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you by this time next year." God promised to bless Ishmael. He would transform into a great nation with 12 rulers. However, the covenant would proceed through Isaac, the son not yet born. And Isaac would be born by this time next year. God provided a specific deadline. That day, Abraham obeyed. Genesis chapter 17, verses 23 and 24 inform us. On that very day, Abraham took his son Ishmael and all those born in his household or bought with his money, every male in his household, and circumcised them, as God instructed him. Abraham was 99 years old when he was circumcised, and his son Ishmael was 13. Abraham didn't delay. He circumcised himself at 99, Ishmael at 13, and every male in his household that same day. Subsequently, Abraham sat at his tent entrance during the heat of the day. Genesis chapter 18, verses 1 and 2 state, "The Lord appeared to Abraham near the great trees of Mamre. While he was sitting at the entrance to his tent in the heat of the day, Abraham looked up and observed 3 men standing nearby. When he observed them, he hurried from the entrance of his tent to encounter them and bowed low to the ground. 3 men suddenly appeared. Abraham demonstrated them generous hospitality. Genesis chapter 18, verses 3 through 5 demonstrate his offer. He declared, "If I have discovered favor in your eyes, my Lord, do not pass your servant by. Permit a little water be brought. And then you may all wash your feet and rest under this tree. Permit me obtain you something to eat, so you can be refreshed, and then proceed on your way. Now that you have arrived to your servant, "Very well," they answered. "Execute as you declare." Abraham offered water, shade, and food. The visitors accepted. Abraham hurried to prepare a feast, bread from finest flour, a choice calf, curds, and milk. He stood near them while they consumed, ready to serve. Then one visitor asked a question. Genesis chapter 18 verse 9 states, "Where is your wife Sarah?" they asked him. "There in the tent," he declared. The fact that they recognized Sarah's name demonstrated these weren't ordinary travelers. Then arrived the announcement. Genesis chapter 18 verse 10 records, "Then one of them declared, 'I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah your wife will possess a son.' Now Sarah was listening at the entrance to the tent, which was behind him. Sarah heard this from inside the tent. Genesis chapter 18, verses 11 and 12 inform us. Abraham and Sarah were already very old, and Sarah was past the age of childbearing. Consequently, Sarah laughed to herself as she thought, 'After I am worn out, and my Lord is old, will I now have this pleasure?' Sarah laughed silently to herself, thinking it impossible. She was too old, her body worn out. Abraham was old. How could they possess a baby now? However, the Lord recognized she laughed. Genesis chapter 18, verses 13 and 14 state, "Then the Lord declared to Abraham, 'Why did Sarah laugh and declare, "Will I really have a child now that I am old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return to you at the appointed time next year, and Sarah will possess a son.'" God asked the most significant question, is anything too hard for the Lord? Nothing is too challenging for God. If God promises something, He can execute it, no matter how impossible it appears to human understanding. Sarah became scared because she realized these weren't ordinary visitors. Genesis chapter 18 verse 15 states, "Sarah was afraid, so she lied and declared, 'I did not laugh.' However, he declared, 'Yes, you did laugh.' Sarah attempted to deny it, but God recognized the truth. She had laughed in disbelief at the promise. But soon, her laughter of doubt would transform into laughter of joy when she held her miracle baby in her arms. God maintained His promise, exactly as He had declared. At the precise time He specified, Sarah became pregnant. Genesis chapter 21, verses 1 and 2 inform us, "Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah as He had declared, and the Lord executed for Sarah what He had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the very time God had promised him. This was a miracle. Sarah was 90 years old. Abraham was 100. They were way beyond normal childbearing age. However, God had promised, and God maintained His word at the exact time He specified. The baby boy was born, and Abraham executed exactly what God had instructed. Genesis chapter 21, verses 3 and 4 state, "Abraham provided the name Isaac to the son Sarah bore him. When his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him, as God commanded him. Abraham named the baby Isaac, meaning he laughs. This name permanently reminded them how both had laughed in disbelief when God promised this child. Now, their laughter of doubt had transformed to joy. Genesis chapter 21, verse 5 adds, "Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him, 100 years old. Abraham was transforming into a father through Sarah at an age when most men would be great-grandfathers. Sarah's response was beautiful. Genesis chapter 21, verses 6 and 7 record, "Sarah declared, 'God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears regarding this will laugh with me.' And she added, 'Who would have declared to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age.' Sarah was full of joy. God had brought her laughter. Genuine, joyful laughter. Everyone who heard regarding this miracle would laugh with her in amazement. Who would have imagined she would nurse a baby at 90? Yet here she was, with Isaac. God had executed the impossible. The baby developed normally. Genesis chapter 21 verse 8 informs us, "The child developed and was weaned, and on the day Isaac was weaned, Abraham held a great feast." Children were typically weaned around age 2 or 3. Abraham threw a big celebration to mark this milestone. A feast with food and joy. During this celebration, something transpired that generated tension. Genesis chapter 21, verse 9 states, "However, Sarah observed that the son whom Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham was mocking. Ishmael, now about 16 or 17, was mocking young Isaac. What exactly he executed isn't specified, but it angered Sarah deeply. Sarah proceeded to Abraham with a demand. Genesis chapter 21, verse 10 records, she declared to Abraham, "Eliminate that slave woman and her son, for that woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac." Sarah wanted Hagar and Ishmael departed. She didn't want Ishmael sharing any inheritance with Isaac. This deeply distressed Abraham. Genesis chapter 21 verse 11 states, "The matter distressed Abraham greatly because it concerned his son. Ishmael was Abraham's son too. The thought of transmitting them away was heartbreaking. However, God communicated with guidance. Genesis chapter 21 verses 12 and 13 state, "However, God declared to him, 'Do not be so distressed regarding the boy and your slave woman. Listen to whatever Sarah instructs you, because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. I will make the son of the slave into a nation also, because he is your offspring.'" God instructed Abraham to listen to Sarah. The covenant would continue through Isaac, not Ishmael. However, God promised Ishmael would also transform into a nation because he was Abraham's son. The next morning, Abraham obeyed. Genesis chapter 21, verses 14 and 15 inform us. Early the next morning, Abraham took some food and a skin of water and provided them to Hagar. He positioned them on her shoulders and then transmitted her off with the boy. She proceeded on her way and wandered in the desert of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was depleted, she positioned the boy under one of the bushes. They wandered in the desert until the water ran out. The situation transformed desperate. Genesis chapter 21, verse 16 states, "Then she proceeded off and sat down about a bowshot away, for she thought, 'I cannot watch the boy die.' And as she sat there, she began to sob. Hagar couldn't bear watching Ishmael die. Consequently, she sat at a distance and cried. But God heard them. Genesis chapter 21, verses 17 through 19 inform us. God heard the boy crying. And the angel of God summoned to Hagar from heaven and declared to her, "What is the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Lift the boy up and take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation." Then God opened her eyes, and she observed a well of water. Consequently, she proceeded and filled the skin with water and provided the boy a drink. God heard Ishmael's cries. An angel instructed Hagar not to fear. God would make Ishmael a great nation. Then God opened her eyes to observe a well she hadn't noticed. She filled the water skin and provided Ishmael a drink. They were rescued. Genesis chapter 21, verses 20 and 21 conclude. God was with the boy as he developed up. He resided in the desert and transformed into an archer while he was residing in the desert of Paran. His mother obtained a wife for him from Egypt. God stayed with Ishmael. He transformed, skilled with the bow, resided in the desert, and married. God maintained his promise to make Ishmael into a great nation. Following these events, God tested Abraham. Genesis chapter 22 verse 1 states, "Sometime subsequently, God tested Abraham. He declared to him, 'Abraham.' 'Here I am,' he replied. Then arrived the command that must have shattered Abraham's heart. Genesis chapter 22, verse 2 records, "Then God declared, 'Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and travel to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will demonstrate you.' God instructed Abraham to take Isaac and sacrifice him as a burnt offering. This signified executing Isaac and burning his body on an altar. This appeared to contradict everything God had promised. How could Isaac possess descendants if he was deceased? However, Abraham had learned to trust God. Genesis chapter 22, verse 3 informs us. Early the next morning, Abraham rose up and loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut sufficient wood for the burnt offering, he departed for the location God had instructed him regarding. Abraham rose up early the next morning. He didn't delay or argue. He assembled supplies and began the journey. Genesis chapter 22, verse 4 states, "On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and observed the location in the distance, 3 days of walking, recognizing what God had commanded. When they could observe the mountain, Abraham departed the servants behind." Genesis chapter 22, verses 5 and 6 state, "He declared to his servants, 'Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy travel over there. We will worship, and then we will return to you.' Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and positioned it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife as the 2 of them proceeded on together. "Notice," Abraham declared, "we will return." He believed somehow they would both come back. As they walked, Isaac asked a question. Genesis chapter 22, verses 7 and 8 record, "Isaac spoke up and declared to his father Abraham, 'Father.' 'Yes, my son,' Abraham replied. 'The fire and wood are here,' Isaac declared. 'However, where is the lamb for the burnt offering?' Abraham answered, 'God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son.' And the 2 of them proceeded on together. Isaac noticed they possessed everything except the animal to sacrifice. Abraham's answer was profound. God himself will provide. He trusted God would provide what was needed. They reached the location. Abraham constructed an altar and arranged the wood. Then arrived the hardest moment. Genesis chapter 22, verses 9 and 10 describe. When they reached the location God had instructed him regarding, Abraham constructed an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar, on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. Abraham tied Isaac and laid him on the altar. Isaac, probably a young man, submitted to his father. Abraham picked up the knife and raised it, ready to obey God's command. However, at that exact moment, God intervened. Genesis chapter 22, verses 11 and 12 state, "However, the angel of the Lord summoned out to him from heaven, 'Abraham, Abraham.' 'Here I am,' he replied. 'Do not lay a hand on the boy,' he declared. 'Do not execute anything to him. Now I recognize that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son.' An angel shouted from heaven. Abraham immediately responded. The angel instructed him to halt. 'Don't hurt Isaac.' Abraham had proved his faith. He feared God so deeply that he was willing to provide up his most precious possession because God requested. Then Abraham noticed something. Genesis chapter 22, verse 13 states, "Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he observed a ram caught by its horns. He proceeded over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son." God had provided a substitute. A ram was caught in a bush by its horns, right when Abraham needed a sacrifice. Abraham took the ram and sacrificed it instead of Isaac. Abraham named the location to remember. Genesis chapter 22, verse 14 records, "Consequently, Abraham designated that location, 'The Lord will provide.' And to this day it is declared, 'On the mountain of the Lord.'" It will be provided. The angel summoned again with more promises. Genesis chapter 22, verses 15 through 18 state, "The angel of the Lord summoned to Abraham from heaven a second time and declared, 'I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have executed this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring, all nations on earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me.'" God swore by himself to confirm his promises. Because Abraham hadn't withheld his son, God would bless him abundantly. His descendants would be countless and would conquer enemies. Through Abraham's offspring, all nations would be blessed. Genesis chapter 22, verse 19 concludes, "Then Abraham returned to his servants, and they departed together for Beersheba. And Abraham stayed in Beersheba. Abraham and Isaac returned to the servants together, just as Abraham had declared. The test was complete. Isaac was alive. God had provided. Years passed, then arrived a day of sorrow. Genesis chapter 23, verses 1 and 2 inform us. Sarah lived to be 127 years old. She passed away at Kiriath Arba, that is, Hebron, in the territory of Canaan. And Abraham proceeded to mourn for Sarah and to weep over her. Sarah passed away at 127. She had observed the miracle son born and develop into a man. Abraham mourned deeply. They had been together through so many adventures. Now she was departed. Abraham possessed a practical problem. He didn't possess territory to bury Sarah. Genesis chapter 23, verses 3 and 4 demonstrate what he executed. Then Abraham rose from beside his deceased wife and communicated to the Hittites. He declared, "I am a foreigner and stranger among you. Sell me some property for a burial site here, so I can bury my deceased." The Hittites responded generously. Genesis chapter 23, verses 5 and 6 record, "The Hittites replied to Abraham, 'Sir, listen to us. You are a mighty prince among us. Bury your deceased in the choicest of our tombs. None of us will refuse you his tomb for burying your deceased.'" However, Abraham possessed a specific location in mind. Genesis chapter 23, verses 7 through 9 state, "Then Abraham rose and bowed down before the people of the territory, the Hittites. He declared to them, 'If you will permit me, bury my deceased. Then listen to me and intercede with Ephron, son of Zohar, on my behalf. So he will sell me the cave of Machpelah, which belongs to him and is at the end of his field. Request him to sell it to me for the full price, as a burial site among you.' Abraham wanted to buy the cave of Machpelah from Ephron. He wanted to pay full price. Ephron offered to provide it free. Genesis chapter 23, verses 10 and 11 record, "Ephron the Hittite was sitting among his people, and he replied to Abraham in the hearing of all the Hittites who had arrived to the gate of his city. 'No, my lord,' he declared. 'Listen to me. I provide you the field, and I provide you the cave that is in it. I provide it to you in the presence of my people. Bury your deceased.' However, Abraham insisted on paying. Genesis chapter 23, verses 12 and 13 demonstrate his response. Again, Abraham bowed down before the people of the territory, and he declared to Ephron in their hearing, 'Listen to me if you will. I will pay the price of the field. Accept it from me, so I can bury my deceased there.' Ephron named a price. Genesis chapter 23, verses 14 and 15 state, "Ephron answered Abraham, 'Listen to me, my lord. The territory is worth 400 shekels of silver. But what is that between you and me? Bury your deceased.' Abraham agreed immediately. Genesis chapter 23, verse 16 informs us, Abraham agreed to Ephron's terms and weighed out for him the price he had named in the hearing of the Hittites. 400 shekels of silver, according to the weight current among the merchants. The transaction was completed publicly and legally. This was the first piece of the promised territory Abraham actually possessed. Genesis chapter 23, verses 19 and 20 conclude. Afterward, Abraham buried his wife Sarah in the cave in the field of Machpelah near Mamre, which is at Hebron in the territory of Canaan. Consequently, the field and the cave in it were deeded to Abraham by the Hittites as a burial site. Sarah was laid to rest in the cave. Abraham possessed a permanent burial location in the territory God promised. Time passed. Abraham was very old, and Isaac needed a wife. Abraham didn't want Isaac to marry a Canaanite. Genesis chapter 24, verses 1 through 4 demonstrate what he executed. Abraham was now very old, and the Lord had blessed him in every way. He declared to the senior servant in his household, the one in charge of all that he possessed, position your hand under my thigh. I want you to swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of earth, that you will not obtain a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I am residing, but will travel to my homeland and my own relatives and obtain a wife for my son Isaac. Abraham made his trusted servant take an oath. The servant had to discover a wife for Isaac from Abraham's relatives, not from the Canaanites. The servant asked a practical question. Genesis chapter 24, verse 5 records, the servant asked him, "What if the woman is unwilling to arrive back with me to this territory? Shall I then take your son back to the homeland you originated from?" Abraham was firm. Genesis chapter 24, verses 6 through 8 demonstrate his answer. "Make sure that you do not take my son back there," Abraham declared. "The Lord, the God of heaven, who brought me out of my father's household and my native territory, and who communicated to me and promised me on oath, declaring, 'To your offspring I will provide this territory. He will transmit his angel before you, so that you can obtain a wife for my son from there. If the woman is unwilling to arrive back with you, then you will be released from this oath of mine. Only do not take my son back there. Isaac must not exit the promised territory." Abraham trusted God would transmit an angel to make the mission successful. Genesis chapter 24 verse 10 informs us. Then the servant departed, taking with him 10 of his master's camels loaded with all kinds of good things from his master. He departed for Aram Naharaim and made his way to the town of Nahor. The servant took 10 camels with expensive gifts and traveled to Abraham's homeland. When he reached, he prayed. Genesis chapter 24, verses 12 through 14 record. Then he prayed, "Lord, God of my master Abraham, make me successful today and demonstrate kindness to my master Abraham. Observe, I am standing beside this spring, and the daughters of the townspeople are emerging out to draw water. May it be that when I declare to a young woman, 'Please lower your jar, that I may possess a drink,' and she declares, 'Drink, and I'll water your camels too.' Permit her be the one you have selected for your servant Isaac. By this I will recognize that you have demonstrated kindness to my master." The servant requested God for a specific sign. He would request a woman for water. If she offered to water all 10 camels too, she was the correct one. This was significant because watering 10 thirsty camels demanded drawing many heavy jars. Hard work, demonstrating kindness. Before he finished praying, the answer arrived. Genesis chapter 24, verses 15 through 20 inform us. Before he had finished praying, Rebekah emerged out with her jar on her shoulder. She was the daughter of Bethuel, son of Milcah, who was the wife of Abraham's brother, Nahor. The woman was very beautiful, a virgin. No man had ever slept with her. She proceeded down to the spring, filled her jar, and emerged up again. The servant hurried to encounter her and declared, "Please provide me a little water from your jar. Drink, my lord," she declared, and quickly lowered the jar to her hands and provided him a drink. Following she had provided him a drink, she declared, "I'll draw water for your camels too, until they have possessed enough to drink." Consequently, she quickly emptied her jar into the trough, ran back to the well to draw more water, and drew sufficient for all his camels. Everything transpired exactly as prayed. Rebekah was from Abraham's family. She provided him water and immediately offered to water all his camels. She worked hard until all 10 had drunk. This was exactly the sign requested. The servant provided her expensive gifts and requested whose daughter she was. She identified herself as Bethuel's daughter. Abraham's family. The servant worshipped God. Genesis chapter 24, verse 27 states, declaring, "Praise be to the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who has not abandoned his kindness and faithfulness to my master. As for me, the Lord has guided me on the journey to the house of my master's relatives." Rebekah's family invited the servant in. He narrated the complete account and requested for their answer. They recognized God's hand. Genesis chapter 24, verses 50 and 51 demonstrate their response. Laban and Bethuel answered, "This is from the Lord. We can declare nothing to you one way or the other. Here is Rebekah. Take her and travel, and permit her transform into the wife of your master's son, as the Lord has directed." They agreed. The next morning, the servant wanted to exit immediately. They requested Rebekah if she would travel. Genesis chapter 24, verse 58 records. Consequently, they summoned Rebekah and requested her. "Will you travel with this man?" "I will travel," she declared. Rebekah agreed to travel, trusting God's plan. They traveled back to Canaan. When they reached, Isaac was in a field. Genesis chapter 24, verse 67 concludes, "Isaac brought her into the tent of his mother Sarah, and he married Rebekah. Consequently, she transformed into his wife, and he loved her. And Isaac was comforted following his mother's death. Isaac married Rebekah, loved her, and discovered comfort following losing Sarah. God had provided the perfect wife through the servant's faithful obedience. Following Isaac's marriage, Abraham lived many more years. He even remarried. Genesis chapter 25, verses 1 and 2 inform us. Abraham had taken another wife whose name was Keturah. She bore him Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shuah. Abraham possessed 6 more sons through Keturah. However, Abraham ensured Isaac remained the primary heir. Genesis chapter 25, verses 5 and 6 state, "Abraham departed everything he possessed to Isaac. However, while he was still living, he provided gifts to the sons of his concubines and transmitted them away from his son Isaac to the territory of the east." Isaac received the main inheritance and covenant promises. The other sons received gifts, but were transmitted away to prevent conflicts. Then Abraham's time arrived. Genesis chapter 25, verses 7 and 8 inform us. Abraham lived 175 years. Then Abraham breathed his last and passed away at a good old age, an old man and full of years. And he was gathered to his people. Abraham was 175 when he passed away. He passed away satisfied, having lived a long, full life. He had observed God's promises begin fulfillment. Abraham was buried beside Sarah. Genesis chapter 25, verses 9 and 10 state, "His sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave of Machpelah near Mamre, in the field of Ephron, son of Zohar the Hittite, the field Abraham had bought from the Hittites. There, Abraham was buried with his wife Sarah. Both Isaac and Ishmael arrived together to bury their father. He was laid to rest beside Sarah in the cave of Machpelah." Genesis chapter 25, verse 11 adds, "Following Abraham's death, God blessed his son Isaac, who then resided near Beer-lahai-roi, God's covenant continued through Isaac. The blessings flowed to the next generation. Abraham's legacy extended far beyond his lifetime. He transformed into exactly what God promised, the father of many nations. Through Isaac arrived Israel. Through Ishmael arrived Arab nations. Through his other sons arrived additional peoples. His descendants transformed as numerous as stars and sand, exactly as God promised. However, Abraham's greatest legacy was faith. Hebrews chapter 11 verse 8 states, "By faith, Abraham, when summoned to travel to a location he would subsequently receive as his inheritance, obeyed and proceeded." Even though he did not recognize where he was traveling, Abraham transformed into the ultimate demonstration of faith. He obeyed God's summons without recognizing the destination. He believed God's promise of a son when impossible. He trusted God sufficiently to offer Isaac. His faith wasn't perfect. He made mistakes, but he maintained trusting God. God's promise that through your offspring, all nations will be blessed, discovered ultimate fulfillment in Jesus Christ, who originated from Abraham's lineage. Through Jesus, individuals from every nation could be blessed. Abraham's faith transformed into the model for all who follow God. Romans chapter 4 verse 3 states, "Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness." Faith, not works, makes someone correct with God. Three major world religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, look back to Abraham as a spiritual father. Billions across thousands of years have been impacted by this one individual who selected to believe and obey God. The promises God established didn't die when Abraham passed away. They continued through Isaac, Jacob, the 12 tribes, and ultimately through Jesus to all who believe. The covenant was eternal and remains active today. Abraham's life demonstrated God maintains promises even when impossible. He demonstrated genuine faith, signifies trusting God when you can't observe how things will function. He demonstrated obedience to God is worth beyond comfort. And he proved one individual walking with God can impact all human history. From Ur to father of nations. That was Abraham's journey. From childless to countless descendants. That was God's faithfulness. From doubt to joy. That was faith's transformation. Abraham's legacy reminds us that when God establishes a promise, nothing halts it from materializing. True. If this account of faith, miracles, and God's faithfulness inspired you, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that subscribe button so you won't miss more astounding Bible accounts that bring these ancient narratives to life. Share this video with your friends and family. Everyone needs to hear how Abraham's faith shaped the world we reside in today. Drop a comment below and permit us recognize what part of Abraham's account impacted you the most. Was it his obedience when God summoned him, the miraculous birth of Isaac, or his willingness to offer his son on Mount Moriah? Remember, Abraham's God is still the God of the impossible. Whatever promises you're waiting for, whatever appears too hard to believe, whatever giants you're confronting, the same God who transformed Abraham's laughter of doubt into laughter of joy is with you today. Maintain believing, maintain trusting, maintain walking by faith, and observe what God will execute. Thanks for watching, and we'll encounter you in the next video.